On behalf of everyone on our team here at the University of Wisconsin Clinical Trials Institute, I wish you all a happy Clinical Trials Day today. It's celebrated every year on May 20th, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar. Clinical Trials Day was established to provide an opportunity to reflect upon and recognize all that has been accomplished thanks to clinical trials and the people behind them. This includes not only the many outstanding clinical research professionals at UW-Madison and UW Health, but also our incredible patient participants, one of whom you will meet today, who are critical partners in our effort to move medicine forward and help improve the health of individuals and communities in Wisconsin and beyond. So we want to send a heartfelt thanks to all of you trailblazers on campus and in our community who go above and beyond to help advance clinical trials innovations at UW. To those of you who may be new to clinical trials, today's program will have a lot of great information for you. And moving forward, please consider our institute to be an informational resource for any questions you may have about clinical trials at UW. Our website is uwclinicaltrials.org. Each year for Clinical Trials Day, we like to host a session that highlights groundbreaking clinical research at UW with perspectives from a researcher as well as a participant to help us better understand the opportunities and challenges involved in participating in a clinical trial. Today, we're pleased to welcome our panelists, Dr. Cynthia Carlson and Marilyn Krause, and our moderator, Dr. Art Walasek. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. As we move along, please add any questions to the Q&A section or to the chat, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion of the program. Also, please note that this session is being recorded, and we will share it with all registrants after the event. With that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Walasek to get us started.
Kevin, thank you. And thank you to you and your team for putting together this event today. I'm really looking forward to it. My name is Art Walasek. I'm a professor of psychiatry and medicine at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. And I'm a geriatric psychiatrist. And many of the patients I take care of either have memory loss or have dementia or are at risk of developing dementia. And so clinical trials are critical for ensuring that my patients get the care that they need for their memory and other related concerns. So in that vein, I'm really delighted to talk today with Dr. Cindy Carlson and with Marilyn Krause about their experiences on both ends of being involved in clinical trials, one in the design and implementation of the trial and the other being a participant. So I'm going to start with Dr. Carlson. Dr. Carlson, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your interest in clinical trials?
Yeah, so thank you, Kevin, for allowing us to be here today, and again, Marilyn for all of her contributions, and Art for being a wonderful colleague and great moderator for these types of sessions. So I'm Cindy Carlson. I'm a geriatrician, so I trained in internal medicine and geriatrics. I'm originally from Michigan. Sorry, I was a Wolverine and then transferred to be a Badger, but I'm wearing red today, so I'm good. So again, my interest in clinical trials, I didn't know it at the time, but was back in junior high and high school. My grandmother developed dementia. They thought it was due to Alzheimer's then, because back in the 80s, they didn't know much about causes of dementia. They just thought dementia and Alzheimer's were the same thing, essentially. And I had already found that I really enjoyed being around older adults. So I decided I wanted to be a geriatrician at that point. So I went into the medical field, a program at University of Michigan, and then came here to Wisconsin for my internal medicine and geriatrics fellowships, and planned on being a primary care clinician. I love being with patients, talking with them, helping older adults become more functional later on in life. And then during my residency here, working with Dr. James Stein, who many of you know, in cardiology, we had a patient on our inpatient service who was a woman in her 80s who came in, had a heart attack, and had a blockage at a part in the blood vessel that was really hard to open up. And so it was going to be very complicated to try to open up this area and prevent her from having another heart attack. She had very high cholesterol levels when she came in, and she had not been treated for her cholesterol because the clinical trials to date had never included older adults in these studies. So these statin drugs, which have been out for years, people are using them in middle-aged adults, people up into their usually about mid-70s, but the studies always cut off at like 70, 75. So we didn't have any good treatments for people with high cholesterol who were older adults. And so after she had a heart attack, then she did qualify to be on a statin drug. And I kept thinking, why did she not qualify to be on a statin drug yesterday? Or the months, the years leading up to this event. And now she's in a situation that she has to have this complicated procedure. And so I started working with Dr. Stein on studies in statins in older adults and seeing, do they have the same benefits in older adults as they do in middle-aged adults? And it really helped me to start thinking that I love primary care. I love taking care of patients, but I also like taking that step back and thinking through problems and seeing if we can bring better treatments and solutions to patients and families. And so around that same time, Dr. Asana moved to University of Wisconsin, and he had an interest in developing more of a dementia research program. At that same time, there was more evidence supporting that vascular risk factors like high cholesterol and all contributed to Alzheimer's dementia. And so I started doing research in that area and then just fell in love with doing clinical research.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful kind of pathway to where you're at right now. I wonder if we could talk next about kind of clinical trials in general, sort of what a clinical trial is, and then we'll springboard from that to talking about the AHEAD clinical trial in particular.
Yeah, so clinical trials, there's different phases of clinical trials. So there's phase 1 clinical trial. So that's where, they test a drug for the first time. Do people tolerate it okay? Are there any side effects? Phase 2, they have a larger number of participants in the study, and they're really trying to see, is it effective? Is it safe? Can we launch it into a larger scale study? Then phase 3 are the ones where these new drugs are compared to standard of care. So if there's another medication that's approved for treatment, or if there's no treatment, then sometimes there'll be a placebo arm. So, and that's usually a larger number of people, so like in the thousands or so. And then once a drug's approved by the Food and Drug Administration, then we move into phase 4 clinical trials where they gather additional information. So it's out in widespread use now. What's the safety parameters? Are they the same? Are there new safety concerns based on larger numbers? So the AHEAD study is a phase 3 clinical trial. And basically it's geared towards trying to catch brain changes and treat those brain changes before someone develops some cognitive symptoms. And so I have a few slides to show just to kind of illustrate. So I'll share my screen and show you a few slides that'll just kind of show you what this trial's about. Make sure you have the, all right, let me switch. All right, are you seeing the correct display now? Is that right?
We're seeing the presenter view, Dr. Carlson.
I'll change back. All right, are you seeing the correct one now then?
Now we're seeing the correct one. Thank you.
Great. So, so again, I do work with these studies. I don't get paid directly from them, but I do work with these studies that are funded through NIH. So one thing that's, as I mentioned with my grandmother, again, she had dementia that they thought was due to Alzheimer's disease. And, but there's a lot of different causes of dementia, and this causes problems when we're trying to think about clinical trials, because previously we didn't have a lot of good ways to identify what are some of the brain changes that cause dementia. So dementia is the bigger umbrella term for memory problems that interfere with a person's ability to do their day-to-day work, interact with people socially. But you can see from this list, there's a lot of different causes of memory problems. So there's Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, which is probably what my grandmother had, Parkinson's disease dementia, and there's a new one that there's just a paper going to be published to kind of describe it because it's a new protein buildup that we didn't really know much about before. But you can see from the pie graph that Alzheimer's brain changes cause most of the type of dementias, but it also mixes with a lot of different types of dementias. And so in this series, seeing my pointer here on there. Okay, so the two key features of Alzheimer's disease are these amyloid plaques, which are made up of sticky deposits of this protein amyloid. And then within the nerve cells or neurons, there are these neurofibrillary tangles, which is made up of tau. So plaques and tangles, amyloid and tau. And so those are the proteins that a lot of these new therapies are targeting. But we don't know a lot of the other therapies or the other types of dementias. We don't really have good markers to see what's causing that dementia. So let's see. So if we look at normal aging over here, so if we are aging normally here, and then develop mild cognitive impairment, which is where we have memory problems, but we work hard and can still make ends meet. It might take us longer to do the same task we used to do, but we can still do the task. It just takes longer. And then once we develop dementia, that's when we defined it as somebody can't do those tasks anymore. Maybe they forget their appointments, they get lost driving and things like that. But in the backdrop of this, there are these accumulating Alzheimer's disease brain changes. So again, by the time we develop some memory changes, we already have quite a bit of brain changes that have built up over time. So what current research is trying to do now is, right now, if we start therapies here and we delay the progression, but we're still progressing. So what we'd like to do is to move these therapies earlier, before we get memory symptoms or at the very earliest stages, so that we can hopefully keep our thinking abilities nice and strong long term. But in order to do that, we need to have what we call biomarkers, which are tools to show us these really early, subtle brain changes way before somebody gets memory symptoms, because we think this whole process takes at least 20 years before we get these symptoms. And so that's where the AHEAD study comes in. So the AHEAD study, it's numerous centers across the United States. It's funded by both National Institutes of Health as well as ASI, which is a company that makes the drug. And it's a phase 3 study. So like I mentioned, those are the studies comparing the treatment to the standard of care. And unfortunately, right now, the standard of care is that there's no effective therapies for preventing dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. There are 2 arms. So there's an arm for people with intermediate levels of amyloid buildup in the brain, and they get this infusion through the veins every 4 weeks for 4 years versus placebo. So again, there's a placebo arm. The A45 arm, people who have elevated amyloid, so at higher levels, they get the infusion every 2 weeks for 2 years, and then it switches to every 4 weeks. So this is a pretty involved study in that you have to come in for screening. There's PET scans involved, imaging of the brain, physical exams, MRI scans of the brain to make sure there's no side effects or risk. So there's a lot of upfront evaluation. And then the participants have to come in, some people every 2 weeks, some people every 4 weeks for the 4 years of the study. So people who are in this study, so again, this is an Alzheimer's prevention study. People do not have Alzheimer's dementia in this study. They're between the ages of 55 to 80, do not have dementia or mild cognitive impairment. They have a study partner, but they do have some elevated levels of amyloid in their brain. So the study has had some encouraging findings in that the study for people, and again, this study that I'm showing is people who already have memory problems, so mild cognitive impairment or dementia due to Alzheimer's. They got this same medicine that we're using as prevention study, and what this picture shows is it dramatically reduced the amyloid in the brains of persons, again, who already had amyloid for probably decades, people with mild cognitive impairment and persons with dementia. So it also delayed progression of their clinical decline. So you can see here that this CDR sum of boxes, what that stands for is a clinical dementia rating scale. It kind of pulls together how they're functioning, how their thinking is. But you can see here that people who are on lecanemab still declined, but they declined at a slower rate than people on placebo. So again, this gets back to why do we want to get earlier, is because we want to protect people's memory from ever declining from the beginning. But there are some side effects in this study. So it can cause some small areas of swelling because the medicine clears out amyloid not only from those plaque deposits, but also from the blood vessels in the brain. And then also it can cause some tiny hemorrhages or microbleeds in the brain. And so we have to watch for these with MRI scans regularly. So again, the study is important because it's going to lead to therapies that will hopefully protect people's memories before they ever get any mild cognitive impairment or dementia. But again, we're looking for people who have some buildup of amyloid in their brain. So it takes, brave people who are willing to find that out to try to really prevent the onset of this disease.
Dr. Carlson, thank you so much. That was just a magnificent summary and overview of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, the other cause of dementia, and why this trial is so important in terms of prevention of the progression of Alzheimer's disease. There may have been some questions generated by that. I'm going to remind folks that we do have the Q&A and chat available, and we'll cover those questions later. I got another question for Dr. Carlson now, and then I'll turn to Marilyn Krause to hear her perspective as a participant. We'll have a little more discussion among the three of us after that, and then we'll open things up to questions. So, Dr. Carlson, you talked some about who's eligible for this study. Something we've become increasingly aware of in the field is the need to have representative samples in our studies. So making sure that kind of all the different folks with respect to gender, racial, ethnic, minority background, and so on are represented in our studies. Can you say a little bit more about that in the context of AHEAD or clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease in general?
It's extremely important that we have good representation. So as I mentioned, the case that made me interested in clinical trials was because they had excluded older adults from these studies. And so when we think about dementia and preventing dementia, the people who are most likely to get dementia are older adults. So again, this study cuts off at 80, but people who are over 85 are the ones who are highest likelihood of getting the disease. So it's important to have age representation, but also different racial and ethnic communities. We're finding in African Americans have a higher risk of dementia, but they have lower levels of amyloid elevation. And so there may be other processes that are contributing to their disease progression. So we need to know that. And same in Latino and Hispanic communities and other indigenous communities as well. So we're really trying to increase representation. Again, people from rural areas, people from urban areas, different racial ethnic groups, and also an age spread as well.
One more quick question for you, Dr. Carlson. If folks are potentially interested in becoming study participants, what should they do?
Well, unfortunately, our study is winding down. Well, unfortunately or fortunately, there is been such a brisk interest in this study that our site is at capacity right now. So I encourage people to follow along with these results. I think that nationwide, the study will be closing probably in the next few weeks as well. So they can still reach out to me if they want to be connected to another site. But again, we've had really brisk response here, which has been fabulous. And we get to talk with one of our fabulous participants next. So
what a fantastic segue, Dr. Carlson. Well done. So Dr. Carlson, thank you so much. And we will loop back around to you in a little bit. So next, I'm delighted to talk with Marilyn Krause, who is an AHEAD study participant, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about what it's like to be in a study from the participant's perspective. So Marilyn, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got interested in participating in clinical trials and in this one in particular?
Sure. Thanks. First, I'd like to say I was really honored to be asked to do this. I pretty much had the mindset that anything I can do to once I was in the study, anything I can do to help, I was willing to do that. So, but I can't see all of you, but I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk with you, and I hope what I say can be helpful at some point. So I am pretty much retired. I kind of struggle with the R word a little bit, but I spent most of my career as a journalist with the Milwaukee Journal and then later the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. For those of us who grew up in Wisconsin, those of you here or are familiar with that publication, I started out as a reporter and ended up as an editor. Was there for about 28 years. And I still do a little bit of communications work for a couple of clients here and there. I'm the oldest of 10 kids, and I'm 71. My youngest sibling is 51. So we've got a pretty good span there. I'm a widow. My husband died just about exactly 3 years ago. We have 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. One big reason why I was interested in this study is I read about it in the Journal Sentinel about 3 years ago, midsummer, and was interested because my father had died from Alzheimer's. He died in 2018, and he had shown symptoms for quite some time, but I would say the last 4 to 5 years were particularly difficult in his just his condition and how it progressed. My mother took care of him at home until about 8 months before his death. And they were in the Lake Mills area, and he was in a memory care facility in Jefferson County, and he died there. My main motivation was because of the experience that I and my family had with my dad. This struck me as a way to give back a little bit. If there is something that I could do to help with research for this disease that really has been a plague for so long, and lots and lots of research over the years. And if there was a way that I could contribute, I was willing to do that. Plus, in all honesty, once I read up about it, after I'd made the initial call and was waiting to be screened, I realized that if I would be accepted for the study, I had a 50-50 chance of receiving a drug that had already been shown to have some benefit. It's probably not as significant a benefit as some of the researchers and physicians would like, but so selfishly, I knew my dad had died from that, and we don't really know about the rest of my family because my dad was the youngest of 10 brothers, and he lived longer than any of them. And so we don't know if anyone else in the family would have had Alzheimer's. So we knew about my dad, but I thought, this has some potential benefit to me and my children, as well as anything I could do through being part of the research. So I guess that's my story. And I'm ready to answer any questions you might have. Art.
Well, thank you. I really, really appreciate you sharing background about yourself and for your motivations for being involved in the study. Let's talk a little bit about kind of what it's been like to be a study participant. So, what did you expect, and what happened? What's it been like so far? Both, things that went well and maybe things that could have gone better.
Well, I really didn't know what to expect. I always say I know enough about clinical research to be dangerous because in my newspaper days, one of my editing responsibilities was I had the medical and science team, and one of our reporters, this is in the mid to late 90s and afterwards, was spending a lot of time on Alzheimer's research. And at that time, there was a lot of focus on amyloid plaque, and then that kind of fell off for a while, and now it's back. But so I knew enough on how these things were generally conducted, so that was not scary or anything. But I really didn't know what to expect. I was surprised at the length and the depth of the physical screening. I guess I shouldn't have been, but I was. And it took a really long time for me to be accepted. I think I had a phone interview in August of 21. And then the first time I was at UW Hospital was for a physical screening in November. And then I had the first infusion in April. So there was a lot of testing in between. And I didn't really know if I would be accepted until I think the final PET scan was maybe a month before the infusion. And I'm guessing that at that point, probably all of you who were involved knew that I was in, but I really didn't. So then I had that first infusion in April of 22. So I'm a little more than halfway through. Um, it's really been a good experience. I've really enjoyed meeting the staff. Everybody has been not only friendly, but caring and competent and very efficient. I have about an hour drive each way, and it's really not been an issue. I've only had to reschedule once for that amazing week in January when we were all in Wisconsin clobbered with snow. So, but it's been very interesting to me, and I ask a lot of questions about the process and about the study. And being a journalist in my earlier life, I guess that's just the curiosity that I have. I'm always asking questions and wanting to know why, which might be a little irritating. I don't know, but I'm genuinely interested in knowing as much as I can, not only because it's happening to me, but I, talk about it to other people so that they're aware of what's going on.
I want to follow up on that point because, your curiosity, your intellectual approach to this really comes through, and you're a very engaged study participant. And so I wonder about that a little bit. Like, is that good? Does it make it, are you more enthusiastic about participating in the study, or does it bring up like more cautions or uncertainties for you, or a little bit of both? What would you advise other folks who might be, study participants or want to be study participants about like this level of, obvious interest and engagement that you have in the study itself?
Well, that's a really thoughtful question. I really have enjoyed being part of it. And I do like the information and so on. But there have been some, I guess, concerning times would be a good way to describe it, because initially, well, I knew that I have an intermediate level of plaque, so I come in every 4 weeks, and I had the general feeling that pretty much everybody over time, as we age, will have some level of plaque in our brains. So I wasn't really happy about it, but I didn't really feel overly concerned about it, other than I think most people, I wish it wouldn't happen. But it was actually in the last few months that there was a reference, and I think it was something I read and then asked about later, where there was a reference to anybody being in the AHEAD study being at high risk for developing Alzheimer's. And that really struck me. That stayed with me because I didn't really think of myself as high risk. I know I have a risk. It's probably a greater risk because of my dad, but I also know that there are some people who might have a strong history of it and never develop Alzheimer's, or vice versa. So I was sort of not too concerned about it, but that really hit me. And so I said, well, I asked at one of my visits, is this really high risk people? And the answer was yes. And so that it took me a while to kind of get past that. I'm this far in. To the earlier part of your question, once I commit to something, I'm going to stay with it unless there's some, overwhelming reason to drop out. So I didn't have any thought about that, but it was a very sobering experience. And then I think just, in the screening process, you get to a couple points where you have to make a decision whether to go ahead or not. And I think that is, I think the main one is after the genetic testing, when if you want to proceed with the study, you need to be told what your APOE, if I have that correctly, APOE numbers are. And I thought really hard about that. I thought about dropping out at that point because I didn't really know if I wanted to know, because that's pretty serious stuff. But ultimately, I decided that, as I mentioned, because my husband died a few years ago, and I do have family close by and all of that, but essentially, I don't have anybody to take care of me. I don't have anybody that I'm living with. And so just for general life planning, it was really something that I felt I should know. So I went ahead and got the results. And thankfully, I did not have any fours. So it was kind of like, okay, that's a relief. So I would have liked to have 2 twos, but I did not. And I'm told that not too many people do, but so that was another point where, it's kind of like, it gets real once in a while. It gets very real. Because initially you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to do this study, and you just kind of go along. And at least for me, I don't think about it that much. It's just something I do every 4 weeks. So it's probably a long-winded answer to your question.
That's fantastic. And I have a follow-up, but I first, just for a moment, want to turn to Dr. Carlson. Marilyn, you presented, beautifully the ApoE story and the 2 and the 3 and the 4. Dr. Carlson, can you give us some context around that? What is the sort of the significance of ApoE testing in those 3 different genes that or variants that Marilyn mentioned?
Yes, thank you. So again, and I want to emphasize that we really, really appreciate Marilyn bringing up these points, because as a research team, we go through this, what we call disclosure process, where we return the results, we go over the amyloid scan, we go over the genetic testing, ask people if they want to find out that. And so we go through it in a certain way we think is helpful, but sometimes the messages we're sharing aren't really connecting. And so I think, Marilyn's feedback on this study has been extremely important, because that'll help us shape how do we communicate, and things like the long screening process, where a lot of times our research team is waiting for the sponsor to give us the go ahead for the next step. So some of those things we can't control, but we can control communicating with our participants and reaching out and updating them on status, or giving them something else to do in the interim. So again, I really, really appreciate Marilyn sharing that, because those are things that we can change as a research team. As far as the ApoE risk, so with the AHEAD study, if somebody has, all of us have one of these 3 alleles, either a 2, a 3, or a 4 from both of our parents. So we can have a 2-2, a 3-3, as Marilyn mentioned, or 4-3. If we have a 2 or a 3, the risk of us having a adverse reaction to lecanemab is lower than if we have a 1 or 2 of the ApoE4 alleles. So the ApoE4 allele not only increases our risk for developing Alzheimer's and progressing, but it also increases our risk for adverse effects from the medication, so the microbleeds or those many swellings, the ARIA. And so that's why for this study, it's important for shared decision making that we let people choose if they want to find out that information. But again, we think it's helpful so that people can decide, oh, I'm going to be at higher risk for some of these side effects than I thought, or I'm at lower risk, so I'm more likely to go ahead with the study. So that's how the genetic risks come in. It increases our risk for progressing if we have one of those 4s, and it also unfortunately increases our risk for side effects from the study drug.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. Marilyn, back to you for a moment. And again, I want to echo Dr. Carlson's thanks to you both for being a study participant. It's a lot of work, and for coming here today and sharing about that experience. I wonder if you could share your wisdom around why participation in clinical trials matters. Why should people be interested in signing up for a clinical trial?
Well, I think it's important, because how else is there would it be possible to have a determination that these potential treatments are safe? You can only go so far with animal studies. Again, I know enough to be dangerous. I know you can't go from animal study to prescribing to humans. So I don't know another way to do that. A couple of people who know that I'm in this study have said, well, that's so brave of you. I don't really think of it as bravery. I guess on one level it is. I guess maybe you have to be a certain amount of a risk taker to do it, but I don't really think of myself that way. It just strikes me as I have a background that makes me more likely to be helpful to a study like this. I know you need people who do not have any evidence of it. You need that too. But if it's not going to be unduly harmful to me, and it's something easy for me to do, I don't know why I wouldn't do it. I mean, it's kind of similar to people who are willing to be on a kidney registry or donate. I was thinking of something else and it left me, but people who are willing to do that, not only for somebody they know, but to do it to a registry where they're just kind of doing it for common good. I don't really go around thinking of myself as this wonderful person, but I can't really think of a good reason not to do it if it's something that can be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very well said. I'm now going to turn to some questions for both of you. And Marilyn, I'll start with you. What's next for you with respect to being a participant in the AHEAD trial?
Well, I have, I guess, a little more than 2 years before I'm done. In fact, I kind of joke, I have a grandson who attends UW, and so we'll be graduating at the same time, which is kind of funny. I recently was told that I could be eligible when I'm finished with the 4 years, I could be eligible for an extension of up to 18 months if I qualify. And barring no ill effects between now and then, I would have a decision about whether to go forward with that. I'm guessing I probably would. There's not really many reasons not to if I haven't had any untoward experiences. A couple times when I've been in at UW and have been talking to the nurses and so on, they've mentioned about there are a number of people who have been in studies in Madison for like 20 years, or they do other studies. I don't know whether I would do that, but I think I will always have an interest in it. And if there were some other way that I could help educate or communicate, which is really what I've done all my life, I probably would do that. I don't know, does that answer your question? Or
Absolutely. When I love you tying it back to kind of mission and purpose for yourself. You've been an educator, you've been a reporter, you've been an editor, so you're about disseminating correct information to folks. And so I like how the work you're doing in the clinical trials is consistent with your values in other parts of your life. So I appreciate your sharing that. Dr. Carlson, what's next for you with respect to the AHEAD clinical trial?
Well, I think, and again, like as Marilyn said, in addition to helping lead the study, and again, we have a great team, Alicia Cole and Olivia Deering and Cecilia Cardenas and another Cynthia Carlson, our colleagues, Ben Farrell, a big team that help make this study happen. So again, it's not just me. But again, with our study team, we're continuing to look at a variety of types of treatments. So again, we want to have studies that are focused on Alzheimer's prevention. That's been a big emphasis of our program, but also studies that look at different mechanisms. So we're looking into different stages of disease. So we're looking at doing studies looking at tau, focusing in on that tau protein in people who already have mild cognitive impairment, or looking at some of the other vascular contributions to developing Alzheimer's disease, or finishing up a VA-based study looking at does that help veterans, and then trying to look at different populations. So expanding to older adults. We have a study called Preventable that we're a site for that looks at what about treatments in people 75 and older up till whatever age. So really trying to broaden out the types of therapies we're looking at across the age spectrum, across the disease spectrum. But again, these biomarkers, and someone had put some questions in the chat, we're also trying to see, can we look for the other factors that are contributing? Can we get a better sense of how much are these blood vessels, diseases contributing? Are there other forms of dementia contributing? And can we treat both of those, et cetera? So I think that's kind of the general direction we're heading. And I'm thankful for the AHEAD study, as Marilyn mentioned. There'll be an open label extension, so people for sure will get on the drug after they finish the double blind part. If they progress to having mild cognitive impairment as part of the study sponsors will provide the drug. Then they'll switch back from placebo to treatment, because that's currently becoming more standard of care out in clinical care. So there's a lot of good things about participating in the study that I'm hoping we'll continue to learn from.
Thank you. Dr. Carlson, so I've got one more question for both of you, and then we'll open it up. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, so we'll head to that. So, Dr. Carlson, I'll start with you on this one. What do you think is the one most important thing we must do next in order to either increase participation in clinical trials and/or ensure greater representativeness, inclusion within our clinical trials?
I don't know if Marilyn, you want to take that, or me to take that first, or?
Can you restate exactly what you're trying to get at a little bit?
Certainly. Marilyn, as a participant, I'd be curious to get your take. What's the one thing that we who do clinical trials work could do to improve access, get more people interested in participating in clinical trials?
Well, I mean, when I first got involved, it was because I happened to read a newspaper article. I would think that, like, if there were another study coming along, or if this one were going to be expanded for some reason, if you could find an efficient way to target the demographic groups that you think, or the broad group, that, because I know you don't want to just go into a narrow criteria, but to do that, I mean, I just happened to see it. So I guess if you tapped into, Wisconsin has a wide network of ADRC, which is, aging resources for seniors and so on, or other groups that focus on people of a certain age, whatever your age span might be. 55 is a little bit young for some of those senior programs, but you still, if you cast a wide net, you would probably get that, because I know that you have to screen a fairly large number of people just to get one person who meets all your criteria and can come into the study. And I think if people just know about it, and if they know that there are normal people, people like me, or maybe I'm not that normal, but just everyday people who can really not only contribute, but find out a lot about their own health and have potential benefits, might be easier to expand and fill up these studies more quickly. Does that fit what you were looking for?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Carlson, is there anything you'd add to that in terms of increasing study participation?
I think the study participation, the challenge has been for us is that as soon as this news about the study came out, we had hundreds and hundreds of people interested. And so trying to get that bottleneck of getting people scheduled and screened, and then it also, I think, draws in people who are kind of watching for that and ready for that, as opposed to other communities where maybe talks about dementia and prevention aren't as widely discussed. And so I think our challenge has been to how do we get to those communities that actually may be at higher risk, but aren't reading the UW newsletters or emails or things like that. So that's where we've been working with our Black Leaders for Brain Health and our Oneida community and others to get feedback from them on how do we reach out to communities in a way that gets the information to them quickly, and in a way that's meaningful and helpful to see if they're interested. So again, I think that the challenge is, again, for another study we did called the A4 study, it was similar design. And for the AHEAD study, we had so much brisk interest. But again, it's not a very diverse interest group. So trying to make sure we get people into study from different communities. It's important.
Thank you. We've got some questions from the audience. And Dr. Carlson has kindly answered a couple of them, and I'll just repeat those. So what is the age range of participants in the study? And Dr. Carlson wrote that it is 55 to 80 years old in the AHEAD study. And then someone else asked, are there tests to find all the different types of dementia? Dr. Carlson wrote, currently there are only tests to find Alzheimer's, amyloid, and tau, but there are some tests for Lewy body disease and late dementia that are getting close. Dr. Carlson, anything else you want to add to that in terms of the biomarkers for different causes of dementia?
No, I think it ties to, well, it ties to another question later, but again, our research group is really focused on trying to identify these earlier biomarkers, especially in blood tests, because they're, again, PET scans are expensive. We do lots of spinal fluid collection, like thousands of spinal fluid collections, but people don't want that. You'd rather have a blood test. And so we're getting closer to having blood tests for this protein called TDP-43 and alpha-synuclein, which will be really helpful to look at those mixed dementias.
And there's a similar question. Feel free to expand on this if you like, but you might have covered this in your answer just now. Dr. Carlson, in addition to identifying interventions that can be tested earlier in the aging process, what other exciting developments do you see on the horizon for biomarkers and dementia-related research in general?
Yeah, I think the biggest emphasis, as I mentioned, was earlier detection, so we can get these studies started earlier, these treatments started earlier. But also there's a movement towards something called pragmatic clinical trials, where it's how do we get these therapies into clinical practice? And so trying to help clinicians better understand, how do I use these biomarkers? Who should I screen? If my patient, which patients are good candidates for these drugs, and who should I send them to? So helping kind of study those types of questions so we can help clinicians really implement using these biomarkers and therapies is really important.
There's a really interesting suggestion / question in the Q&A, and I'd be curious, Marilyn, Dr. Carlson, to get both of your perspectives on this. Is it possible to set up a communication group among study participants, as this is the first time I've had a chance to learn from another participant? The staff are great, but it can be somewhat isolating, wondering how my experiences compare with other participants.
Marilyn, what are your thoughts?
I certainly wouldn't be opposed to it. I'm wondering how that would be accomplished, because I think the only study I know of is the one I'm in, and I think people come from a fairly wide geographical area in Wisconsin, but there's all kinds of digital ways to get together. I kind of wonder, though, how many people might want to be so open about something like this. I'm guessing that some people might not even want people to know they're in a study. I've had the experience where if I've mentioned it, people kind of would look at me strangely at first, and some of them would actually say, "Oh, you mean, do you have Alzheimer's?" And I'd say, "No, I don't. This is a study for people who don't have any symptoms." But it's something that I'd probably be willing to do. But again, I have a news background. It's just kind of, it wouldn't bother me as much as it might bother some people. They might want to keep that more private.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Value your perspective, Marilyn, because I think so as a team, we obviously don't disclose who's in the study, obviously, to anyone, even other participants, even if they say my friend's in the study, we're like, okay. Maybe if they've told each other, I told you my friend, I'm like, okay. But again, we have to keep people's privacy. But for our other study, the A4 study, which is very similar, cognitively unimpaired, 65 to 85, elevated amyloid. We did have participant thank you events and just by allowing people to come, people were choosing to identify that they're part of the study. And so we try to provide some updates, and we've had some discussions around that. If we want to have some events, but again, by showing up, people are showing that they're in this study. Like you said, I think people have different perspectives on what they're allowing people to, what they want people to know about them. And one comment too that I think is really important that Marilyn brought up is that there are some scientists who do Alzheimer's research who are trying to push for clinicians to diagnose people as having, like, to go on their charts of having Alzheimer's disease, even if they have these brain changes without any symptoms, which most of us are, very much opposed to, because having some brain changes does not mean people will get memory loss down the road. We know that from lots of studies, autopsy studies, Nun study, lots of research shows that just because someone has these brain changes does not mean for sure they're going to get Alzheimer's. There's a lot of other factors that go into, they won't get Alzheimer's dementia, just to be clear. And so, again, I think this is a disease with stigma associated with it. Like Marilyn said, she doesn't want people to think she has Alzheimer's. She doesn't have Alzheimer's the way lay people and people in the communities think about it. There are brain changes that you also find in Alzheimer's, but there does not mean that somebody's going to get a dementia down the road. We know that for sure. So yeah, I think those kind of events would be great. We'd be very much for supporting those if people, either virtual or in person. And this is where participant feedback is so important, because I agree with the person who noted that it can feel isolating because you don't know other people going through this. You might get comments like Marilyn did, like, oh, you have Alzheimer's, and to be able to share those experiences with each other could be helpful.
Thank you. Dr. Carlson, here's a great question. And we've kind of touched on this in various aspects. This is the issue of disclosure, sharing with people, or conversely, if you're a participant, knowing or wanting to know what some of these test results are. So here's the question. I see participants requesting their amyloid and tau results and so on in the chat. Do you find that common, or do people just not want to know?
Well, for this study, we share back the results of their amyloid scan with everyone, and we offer to share back their genetic testing, the ApoE testing, with everyone, but that's optional if someone wants to find that out or not. The tau scan is a different type of PET scan that looks at that other protein buildup, and it's in the tau scans aren't quite as refined as the amyloid scans, and so right now the study does not give us those results back to share back with participants. But like with the A4 study, by the time the study ended, the same group of investigators who set this study up through NIH gave us that information to share back with participants. So I wouldn't be surprised at the end of this study if we're able to get the tau results and share those back with participants. That being said, in our Alzheimer's Center, which is an observational cohort, we do amyloid and tau scans, and those participants too. And they have the option to find out whether or not they have elevated amyloid or tau. And many choose not to. Many say, I don't want to find out. I don't want to know. Whereas people who are coming to try out for the AHEAD study, they want to know because they know they have to know if they have elevated amyloid or they won't be in the study. So it's a different group of people coming out for the clinical trial than who are coming for the Alzheimer's Center. But some people say they don't want to know. So.
Thank you. Marilyn, I want to first point out that someone gave you the heart hands emoji, I think, for something you were saying. And some hearts just showed up there as well. I didn't do that on purpose. I didn't know that was going to happen. So a marker of appreciation of you. And also a question. I think you touched on this in one of your responses, but I want to go back to it. So Marilyn, thank you so much for sharing your story. After your experience as a participant in this trial, would you consider participating in additional clinical trials?
I think I might. It would depend what kind of a study it is, and how much time would be involved, and whether I thought I could really make a contribution. So I wouldn't say yes or no definitively without knowing more. But yeah, I wouldn't rule it out.
Thank you. It's a good informed consent. You'd want to know more about the actual thing you're signing up for.
Right.
That makes sense. So, and speaking of availability of clinical trials, Dr. Carlson, there's a very specific question that I'll read, and it'll lead to a broader question. The specific question is, my grandfather, uncle, aunt all passed away from Alzheimer's on my mother's side. My mother was diagnosed less than 2 years ago, is 81, progressing with the disease on a medication called memantine to help slow down memory decline. She is not eligible for lecanemab because she is on apixaban, a blood thinner. I am 51 years old. Are there any trials available for people my age? And I guess maybe the more broad question, Dr. Carlson, is where would people go? Like, for example, the Wisconsin ADRC website or other places, like how would they learn about clinical trials to see if they might be eligible for them?
There are a couple different places that I would recommend. So as I mentioned, we are always taking on new clinical trials and trying to expand our study, the age range, the disease spectrum, prevention, treatment. The best place to go is on our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center website to look at get involved. And I will put that in the chat if I can multitask quickly enough. So that will have information about current clinical trials. The other thing is a lot of studies are for treatment studies, they have a cutoff of about 55. And again, the AHEAD study just kind of recently, like last week, said we're going to focus on, for the last remaining recruitment, they're going to focus on people 65 and above, because people 55 to 65 don't really have that much amyloid. Even if they were to develop some more later, they don't have as much for the drug to really work again. So they are still included in the study, those who are already enrolled into it. But the other option is also Alzheimer's Association has Trial Match. So you can go on there for other, thank you for whoever put our EDRC link in there, because I can't multitask. But Alzheimer's Association has a trial match. You can also go on clinicaltrials.gov, has all clinical trials have to post with clinicaltrials.gov. And so those are a few different ways to find out studies nationwide, but locally, our Alzheimer's Center is probably the best starting point.
Thank you very much. And we are out of time for questions. I know we did not get to everyone. There were a couple of very specific AHEAD questions, and I would just encourage those folks to reach out to Dr. Carlson directly to ask those questions. So I want to thank you, Dr. Carlson, Marilyn, thank you so much. This has just been phenomenal interacting with both of you in this way. I'm sure our audience found it extremely helpful, and will join me in giving you a virtual round of applause for joining us today. And I will hand things back to Kevin to close us out.
Yeah, I want to echo those thanks, and special thanks to you, Marilyn, for joining us and sharing your story. It's so important for us to hear from clinical trials participants, and I know this is not an easy thing to do. So we just can't thank you enough for joining us today. And I also want to thank Dr. Carlson and Dr. Walasek for a fantastic discussion today. It was really informative and just really great to hear.